She's so wonderful.
Was she there?
Yeah. Was Italy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Karen Wiseman from the Department of English and Center for Jewish Studies. This is the David Lipson Memorial Fund Lecture, and we're very grateful for that support. And I'd also like to acknowledge that it's Truth and Reconciliation today. And I think Sarah Gracombe's talk will dovetail very nicely with some of the things we keep in mind during that day. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Gracombe. She'll be speaking to us on adapting the Book of Ruth in American literature and culture. Since earning her PhD from Columbia University, Sarah Gracombe has been a professor of English at Stonehill College, which is right outside of Boston. Until recently, she served as the director of the college's honors program, and before that, she served as director of the Ideas program for democratic education. Her teaching and research interests include Victorian representations of national belonging, race, gender, psychology, and religion, and particularly constructions of Jewishness. Her work has appeared in many important journals and volumes, including, for example, 19th Century Literature, Romantic Circles, Philological Quarterly, Proof Text, Victorian Periodical Review, as well as such collections as George du Maurier, illustrator, author, critic, and also in the volume Bastards and Believers, Jewish Converts and Conversion from the Bible to the Present. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Gracombe.
Just this slightly. So thank you very much, Karen, and thank you all for coming, especially on such a beautiful day. I really appreciate you being here. I want to start with a brief but crucial moment, kind of a preview of coming attractions from one of the main texts that I'll be discussing today, Israel Zangwill's 1908 play, The Melting Pot, before stepping back to provide some context about my larger project and argument. I come to you, and I say in the words of Ruth, thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. So says Vera, a Russian Christian immigrant in America, to David, a Russian Jewish immigrant in America, in the melting pot. This moment stands out for several reasons. It takes place right after David has discovered that Vera's father murdered his family in the Kishinev pogrom. It captures Vera's departure from her own family, and it intertwines marriage, religion, and nation. It's especially interesting because it does so by adapting the biblical story of Ruth, incorporating Ruth's words to Naomi, one of the most quoted sections of the Bible. We'll hear it a lot today, one that's sometimes repurposed as a marriage vow, and sometimes, as I'll argue, as a pledge of allegiance. The romantic desires of fictional immigrants in turn-of-the-century America may seem far from biblical Bethlehem. Yet Zangwill reveals the striking resonance and adaptability of Ruth's story in this period, and he was not alone. As I hope to demonstrate, Ruth is a frequent, if sometimes overlooked, figure in the cultural imaginary of 19th and early 20th century America. Today I'll examine, or I kind of hope we can examine together, why such writers turned to Ruth. What does the trajectory of Ruth representations help us glean about the rich, complex, and perpetually contested categories of American Jewish identity? And I should note, thanks. I feel like you're obligated to make at least one gleaning pun when you are dealing with Ruth, so I've checked that one off. Yeah. The seeds for this project were planted several years ago when I was a fellow at Penn's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. As part of that year's investigation of conversion, we read the Book of Ruth and related commentaries. The variety of these commentaries among contemporary biblical scholars and cultural critics is notable. To cite just a few examples, and there are many, J. Hillis Miller employs Ruth to address the nature of literary theory and translation. Bonnie Honig and Julia Kristeva to address through a psychoanalytic lens debates about immigration. Rebecca Alpers to address lesbian connections among Jewish women, and Sylvia Barak Fishman to address the liberating power of mothers. Even the New York Times columnist David Brooks has used Ruth's devotion to Naomi to address changing models of friendship. I'm pretty sure this is the only time the Book of Ruth has been compared to Sex and the City. But since I am not a biblical scholar, I was reading the Book of Ruth through the lens of 19th century British literature and realized that it helped me better understand a puzzling part of one of the most famous works from this period, Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, which counterintuitively describes Ruth as standing in tears amid the alien corn. This led to the first part of my larger project, which is looking at Ruth in romantic literature and visual art. At the time, though, I was also reading a lot of Israel Zangwill. Out of curiosity, I'm going to guess I know the answer, but has anybody read anything by Israel Zangwill here? Okay, good to have a few. So hopefully I'll give enough background that you can kind of jump in as well. Zangwill has largely dropped out of the literary canon, as we can see, but in the early 1900s, he was, in the words of one of his biographers, probably the most famous Jew in the English-speaking world. This is what led me to The Melting Pot. I was surprised to find a writer so invested in Englishness had written one of the defining works championing Americanness. I was even more surprised to find that this championing is undergirded by the Book of Ruth. So with Zangwill as a kind of transatlantic bridge, I began to investigate how Ruth traversed not just the English, but also the American cultural landscape. So if you search Jewish American literature and periodicals, and I have spent some time in the archives of journals like the American Jewess, American Hebrew, the Occident, as well as things like the New York Times, you come to, or at least I came to, sort of three main conclusions. First, and most frustratingly, sometimes a character named Ruth is just a character named Ruth, right? No matter what interpretive gymnastics you do. But secondly, nonetheless, there were indeed many interpretations and representations of biblical Ruth in American literature and culture, more than I had anticipated and more than had been fully analyzed and put into conversation by other scholars. I want to note one exception, Ilana Pardes, who I understand is coming later this semester, and whose excellent 2022 book on Ruth is probably most similar to my work in its attention to the Book of Ruth's cultural afterlives. She covers an impressive range of Ruths from biblical times through modern Israel, but doesn't discuss Ruth in 19th or 20th century English literature, and only briefly in American literature, mostly in a few more recent works. In contrast, in my research, I found it's precisely in 19th and early 20th century England and America where Ruth shows up most often and where the Book of Ruth's central questions seem most relevant. This brings me to my third overarching point. There are many reasons Ruth became a compelling figure for American writers, but all stem from the way the particulars of her biblical narrative chimed with the cultural dynamics of their own era, one in which the Jewish population in America increased dramatically, as did a rise in both acceptance and anti-Semitism. From the 1850s to the 1920s, many writers saw key questions about American Jewish identity refracted through the Book of Ruth. What, for Jews in America, did immigration and intermarriage actually feel like? Does joining a new people require joining a new faith? Can my people pledge allegiance to we the people without losing their Jewishness? And what exactly is that Jewishness? To understand what sparked these questions, it helps to do a quick review of the Book of Ruth. I'm guessing people might be somewhat familiar with this, but bear with me. While more complicated than its deceptively simple story might seem, the Book of Ruth has often been read as a welcoming counterpoint to Ezra and Nehemiah. It opens when Naomi and her family leave Bethlehem due to famine and arrive in Moab. So from the first, this is really a tale of border crossing. Her sons soon marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But after their deaths and that of her husband, Naomi decides to leave the country of Moab and return to Bethlehem. Initially, Ruth and Orpah say they're going to follow Naomi. But when Naomi urges them to turn back, famously only Ruth refuses, declaring in the King James iteration, which was probably the most well-known at this time, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." Together, they journey to Bethlehem, where, to make a short story even shorter, Ruth gleans in Boaz's fields, marries Boaz, and their son Obed becomes a forebearer of David and Jesus, making Ruth, a Moabite, essential to both Jewish and Christian lineage. Through Ruth, the incorporation of foreigners and immigrants into the Jewish people is celebrated. Moreover, in both Jewish and Christian theology, Ruth has been one, if not the first converts. But there's an ambiguity about just what she converted to: a family, a faith, an ethnic group, or something more like a nation. The ambiguity is embedded in Ruth's pledge to Naomi. The ands, as you can see, simultaneously allied and distinguish between these categories. Because the Book of Ruth can be read as revealing the uncertainties of what, from a 19th century vantage point, resembled conversion, immigration, intermarriage, and national belonging, I argue that referencing Ruth becomes a way to wrestle with these uncertainties. Many of the writers from this period, especially Zangwill and also Emma Wolfe, whose novel Other Things Being Equal we will shortly consider, vacillate about whether turn-of-the-century Jewishness is a religion, a race, a nation, a set of cultural practices, or all of the above. What I want to emphasize is that the same ambiguities applied to turn-of-the-century Americanness. The view of America as secular competed with the view of America as a Christian nation in spirit, if not in law. The view that American identity rests in cultural habits and communal values competed with the view that it rests in race, hierarchies of whiteness. Historian Eric Foner defines this tension as that between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, arguing that, quote, "For most of our history, American citizenship has been defined by blood as well as by political allegiance and cultural practices." Werner Sollers likewise terms this tension the tension between consent and descent. These tensions align well with the Book of Ruth. After all, Ruth is rewarded for prioritizing consent over descent. Recognizing the ways Zangwill, Wolfe, and others allude to the story of Ruth can help illuminate these parallels and tensions in an America cast as a new Israel, but not always such a welcoming one, for the roughly 2 million Jews who arrived between 1880 and 1925. Despite the fact that it seems like a reversal of the biblical story, in which it's the non-Jewish woman who joins the Jewish people, some Jewish writers reimagined, and modernized Ruth as a successful, if not uncomplicated, template for Jewish belonging in America. As the Anglo-Jewish writer Grace Aguilar put it in Women of Israel, a work in which she explores Ruth and which was also reprinted and praised in the US, the women of the Bible are but mirrors of ourselves. A quick testament to how much Ruth permeated all aspects of 19th century American culture is this 1890 ad for Hires root beer. As you might be able to see, they're using Philip Calderon's painting of Ruth and Naomi, one of countless paintings in the 19th century depicting Ruth. I'm just gonna speed through a few there, as part of their sales pitch. So if you send 5 labels, you get a lithograph of this painting. Employing a painting of Ruth to sell more root beer shows just how adored the Book of Ruth was. Indeed, the ad's description, and this is probably too hard to see, captures how Ruth was often perceived in the period as the subject of one of the most, quote, touching episodes of scripture whose womanly warmth and devotion cannot be too much admired. Ruth was often employed as a model of 19th century gender norms, and this is evident in part from a genre popular with both Jewish and Christian writers in the mid to late 1800s, the compilation of famous religious women, which blended scriptural exegesis, fictional biographies, and kind of conduct book style advice. Examples include Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of the best-selling anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, who had a chapter about Ruth the Moabitess in her Women in Sacred History. That's in the middle there. And Reverend E.Y. Higby's Ruth in Women of the Bible. And that picture in the end of Ruth leaning, looking very demure, is from his work. Similarly, there is Sarah Josephet Boole Hale's Ambitious Women's Records or Sketches of All Distinguished Women from the Creation to AD 1854, Sarah Town Martin's Women of the Bible, and so on. One of the most interesting contributions to this genre comes from Jewish American writer Rebecca Heinemann's poem, Ruth and Naomi. This meditation on Ruth is also part of a series entitled Female Scriptural Characters. Although 14 women are covered, the figure of Ruth had particular resonance for Heinemann, child of a German Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother who herself married a Jewish man. Thus, intermarriage and conversion weren't abstractions to her, but part of her experience. Heinemann opens her poem by imagining the forms of 2 women appearing out of the faintly penciled past, a biblical realm read through the lens of romantic discourse. Ruth soon speaks the lines so familiar, they're like, quote, some sweet melody we've heard in dreams. You can see how she's using the pledge. And I should say that weaving a version of Ruth's pledge into your poem was a fairly standard trope at the time. Heinemann then fills in gaps in the biblical tale to emphasize the love that Naomi must have felt for her son, Ruth's now dead husband, and the bond this creates between them. In the Bible, we learn hardly anything about him. We have no idea whether he was a good son or a good husband. But Heinemann and other 19th century writers invested in feminine domesticity often leaned into the notion that Ruth's devotion to her husband is one reason she chooses to follow Naomi. Here, Ruth reassures her mother-in-law, I will watch by thee as thou didst watch him, the departed. The poem's final stanza further shows how Ruth is at home in Victorian gender norms, lauding her love and pure unselfishness in an era in which women's love was regularly equated with self-sacrifice. And yet the poem also foreshadows an increasing attention to Ruth as a woman who sought a new home, in a new land, one that resonated particularly with Jewish Americans at this time. The speaker emphasizes the physical challenges of Ruth's journey, describing Ruth as frail, weary, travel-soiled, and faint. She also emphasizes the emotional challenges, reminding readers that Ruth left her, quote, childhood home, her fondly cherished friends, and felt sad and hopeless grief. And here too, Heinemann is really departing a bit from the Bible, which says little about Ruth's feelings towards Moab, but she might be following the tradition inaugurated by Keats. Regardless, Heinemann captures the sorrows of leaving home and the rewards and possible pleasures of a new nation. As we get closer to the turn of the century, the connection between the Book of Ruth and national dynamics becomes more visible. Consider a much praised sermon on the Book of Ruth by Reverend Morgan in New York in 1861, 8 months into the Civil War. Morgan reads Ruth as a lesson in, quote, steadfastness and loyalty, socially and religiously. Citing Ruth's pledge, of course, Morgan criticized those, quote, officials of the United States who left Washington and betrayed their mother country, comparing Civil War seceders to Orpah. The sermon concludes by advocating, quote, patriotism, not such patriotism as could be parted with in a kiss, as Orpah had parted with Naomi, but a Ruth-level patriotism that would bring, quote, peace and prosperity for our departed country. This is just one example of how the Book of Ruth was invoked in relation to Americanness at moments of heightened national self-scrutiny, defense, and definition. Okay, so I want to turn now to 2 case studies, Zangwill's Melting Pot, and first, Emma Wolf's novel, Other Things Being Equal, the story of a Jewish heroine named Ruth Levis and her controversial marriage to a Christian man. Although Wolf and Zangwill never met, Wolf lived in San Francisco, Zangwill in London, they corresponded. In his reply to Wolf's first letter, Zangwill wrote, I've already heard of you, but vaguely, but then called her the most promising Jewish writer of the younger generation. Today, few readers have heard of Wolf even vaguely, but at the time, Zangwill's view that the work of Miss Emma Wolf, quote, stands out luminous and arrestive, wasn't anomalous. Laurie Harrison Kahan has even suggested that Zangwill himself may have been influenced by her novels. Other Things Being Equal, Wolf's first novel, was published in 1892, reissued 6 times in 10 years, and according to reviews, was read by Jews and Gentiles with equal interest. The Chicago Tribune praised its, quote, beautiful purpose, which it defined as a better understanding between Jews and Christians that overcomes racial rivalries and prejudices. Admittedly, some of the novel's language and plotting is outdated, but this beautiful purpose makes Other Things Being Equal feel at times quite contemporary. The character's struggles to define Jewishness, and thus what might be lost and gained through intermarriage, as well as the necessity of recognizing and overcoming unconscious biases, could be pretty at home in a novel from our own era. I argue it's an important and unrecognized way that the novel resists such biases through allusions to the Book of Ruth. Some are admittedly subtle. In one of the earliest glimpses of Ruth Levis, whose beauty is, quote, faintly oriental, she wears an unusual corn-colored dress, which recalls images of Ruth gleaning. But of course, the main allusion to the Book of Ruth is not surprisingly Ruth Levis herself. This is a character whose name actually really earns the biblical history. Like her biblical namesake, this Ruth falls in love with a generous man from a different background, Herbert Kemp, a Unitarian, and a respected doctor who treats not just Ruth's mother, that's how they first meet, but also those in need, which recalls Boaz's assistance to Naomi and those gleaning in his fields. Also, like Boaz, Kemp is quite a bit older, 35 to 22, and functions as a mix of protector and suitor. The novel charts their developing romance and the critique it prompts. To be clear, I'm not saying this is an exact updating of the Book of Ruth. Obviously, here Ruth is the Jewish character, not the Moabite, but her position as a Jew, a minority in America, aligns her with the Bible. The connections to Ruth's biblical namesake thus become a way for Woolf to draw our attention to the stakes of this marriage plot. The novel explores what happens when the marriage plot collides with what Zangwill calls the intermarriage problem. So if you've ever read a 19th century novel, you probably know that the marriage plot was the primary narrative structure for mediating conflict, personal, but also national. Here we might say that the conflict is whether intermarriage is actually a problem. As Woolf illustrates, plots about interfaith relationships in America are inevitably also plots about the meaning of Jewishness and Americanness. This is made clear particularly by Ruth's father, who, despite having been one of the biggest advocates for interfaith dialogue, resists this marriage. "Child," he says, "you are a Jewess. Dr. Kemp is a Christian." Ruth retorts with her own sort of simple response: "What difference can that make since we love each other?" To Ruth, Jewish difference matters far less than American sameness. Throughout the novel, she asserts her, quote, equality with my Christian friends. We have the same schooling, speak the same language, read the same books, have the same home refinements. In other words, the other things of the title, class, culture, sense, and sensibility, are already equal. The novel asks us to agree with Ruth, but still to take her father's objections seriously. And I should note that even though she strongly agrees, Ruth initially breaks off the engagement out of respect for her father. Concerns about intermarriage often rest on fears about losing something distinctively Jewish, but just what that something was remained difficult to delineate. Mr. Levis worries first that his daughter might be ostracized, feel unwelcome in both communities, but he also asserts that there are, quote, certain hereditary traits, something in the blood, that in his view rightly differentiates Gentiles from Jews. He surprises Ruth by this shift to aligning Jewishness with race, but he fits the pattern identified by Eric Goldstein, who argues that intermarriage debates revealed the strong emotional attachment Jews still had to a racial self-understanding in this period. Indeed, the novel mirrors debates at the time. The rate of actual intermarriage is hard to codify. One scholar says that before 1940, there were really only about 2 to 4% of Jews who intermarried. Others put it a little bit higher. Regardless, though, the rate of discussions about intermarriage was extremely high and often relied on the Book of Ruth as a kind of proof text. According to Anne Rose's study of interfaith marriage, the Bible functioned as a reminder that, quote, interfaith marriage was not something new, but something very old. Biblical pronouncements shaped interfaith families. In 1896, Annie Josephine Levy's essay Intermarriage exemplifies Rose's claim. She argues, quote, the Bible reveals instances of the command against mixed marriage being disobeyed. The beautiful pastoral of the Book of Ruth would seem to prove that such alliances were fruitful of good. Was not Ruth the Moabitess progenitor of the royal house of David? And yet, Levy ultimately concludes that intermarriage leads to perilous, quote, de-Semitizing influences. In fact, she cites other things being equal, worrying that it will sow dangerous seeds in the minds of youth. Influential Reform Rabbi Emil Hirsch also looked to the Bible, but this time to support intermarriage, noting that it was common in biblical times. Unlike Levy, whose focus on Semitizing implies a racialized Jewishness, Hirsch insisted, quote, Judaism is rooted in our conviction and not in our blood. Woolf's novel takes the same approach. Like the original Ruth, Ruth Levis's narrative suggests that identity gains meaning through conviction, the act of choosing. In this case, Ruth makes two crucial choices. First, to marry a non-Jew, and second, to actively choose her own Judaism, to remain Jewish not just by default, but by active commitment. The importance of choice is reinforced when Kemp explains that if they're blessed to have children, they will let them choose their religion for themselves, as all should be allowed. By alluding to the Book of Ruth, Woolf bolsters the case that incorporating the stranger and accepting intermarriage are already parts of Jewish tradition. Here, intermarriage actually functions to deepen, not diminish, Jewish affiliation. For both Woolf and Zangwill make a notable departure from the Book of Ruth, in which religious conversion precedes intermarriage. Other things being equal, and the melting pot, model interfaith unions predicated on the lack of religious conversion, so long linked to violence and coercion for Jews. Each partner promises to support the other during their observances. Kemp plans to go to temple, and Ruth plans to show her respect for Jesus. But Ruth holds tight to her own religion, declaring, I am a Jewess and will die one. My God is unalterable. A review in the American Jewess lauded precisely this aspect of the novel, the way it, quote, ingeniously holds out the possibility of such a union without violating religious principles. Ultimately, the novel suggests that what needs to change here is not religion, but ingrained prejudices about religion. One thing I think Woolf and Zangwill, as writers of fiction, can provide for us is this sort of imaginative filling in of the lacunae in the Book of Ruth about doubt, bias, uncertainty that's experienced when someone joins a new relationship, a new family, a new nation. On Kemp's side, he must recognize his, what we would think of today as a kind of implicit bias about Jews. There's this really interesting moment when Ruth calls him out after a stray comment exposes his submerged belief in, quote, racial difference between Jews and Christians. She has a very prescient critique of the way he treats her as, quote, the one Jew, the exceptional Jew, who has somehow escaped from what she calls the mental ghetto in which he's involuntarily confined other Jews. He quickly apologizes and re-examines his assumptions, because in fiction, that can happen very quickly and easily. Ruth's father must also do the same. At the end of the novel, he has an epiphany he describes in language that foreshadows Zangwill's melting pot. He's in New York City, he's looking down from a tall building and says, below me prayed Jew and Christian, Mohammedan and Buddhist, pagan and atheist. Why was man thus separated from man? Seeing this melting pot, he realizes that there is, quote, one God for all humans. At his insistence, Ruth and Kemp marry in a somber ceremony by his deathbed. The novel concludes with a tempered happiness captured in its last line, and so the future took them. It at once suggests the uncertainty of their married lives. Just grammatically, the future has more agency than they do, and a vision for an American Jewish future in which intermarriage is supported. As if to clarify her stance in favor of this marriage and this future, in her preface to the revised edition, Woolf insists, the humanist love knows no sect. In 1907, an article in the North American Review expressed the hope that, quote, immigrants become so enamored of our country that they will be eager to exclaim in the language of Ruth to Naomi, yes, you're going to hear it again, where you shall dwell, we also shall dwell. Your people shall be our people, and your God, our God. 1 year later, Vera, in The Melting Pot, does just that. Between the publication of Woolf's novel and that of The Melting Pot, Jewish population in America dramatically increased. By 1914, 2 million Jews had arrived from Eastern Europe. By 1915, 1/4 of New Yorkers were Jews. Zev Elef notes, journalists sometimes drew a parallel between Ruth and immigrants at Ellis Island. Given this demographic and cultural shift, it's not surprising that in Zangwill's play, the Book of Ruth illuminates Jewish experiences, not just of intermarriage, but of immigration. Unlike in Woolf's novel, here almost all the characters, certainly all the good ones, are immigrants. And America itself becomes the play's most dynamic character. Zangwill highlights how both David and Vera are, in their own ways, like Ruth, in that they immigrate, intermarry, and convert, even though neither changes their religion. Instead, I want to argue that through its repurposing of Ruth's pledge, its metaphor of the melting pot, and its persistently religious imagery, the play advocates not a religious conversion, but a national conversion to Americanness. Although best known for his fiction about the double-edged sword of Anglicization, and then for his shifting, complicated stances on Zionism, in The Melting Pot, Zangwill enthusiastically, even sappily, touts America as the land of belonging for Jews, even though he, more than almost any other writer I can think of, repeatedly struggles to articulate what that is. Zangwill once claimed playwriting is a branch of politics. Fittingly, he dedicated The Melting Pot to Teddy Roosevelt, who attended the premiere as president and later claimed the play was, quote, among the very real and strong influences on his thinking. Despite this presidential praise, the play had an uneven history and pretty much disappeared by 1920. Yet the melting pot metaphor, not originated by Zangwill, but certainly established in the cultural mindset by him, has lived on, becoming, in Edna Nashon's words, a key image in the country's self-definition. And as you may know, I don't know, we're in Canada, but you may know it is still a source of tremendous debate. The play opens in David's house, where he lives with his uncle Mendel and his grandmother. This scene is set literally by the stage directions, which describe, quote, a curious blend of shabbiness, Americanism, Jewishness, and music. Hebrew tomes share space with pictures of Lincoln and Columbus. An American flag hangs near a mezuzah. The core question of the play is whether this curious blend is sustainable and valuable for Jewish immigrants, as well as for America. Of course, answering this question requires having a definition of Jewishness, something the characters themselves actively debate. Exposing familiar by now frictions between kind of race, heredity, ethnicity, descent, and belief, choice, observance, consent. These frictions are again heightened by intermarriage. When Mendel learns of David's plan to marry Vera, he accuses him of being false to his race and ignoring, quote, the call of our blood, echoing the same anxieties we just looked at. David counters that in the melting pot of America, quote, God is fusing our race with all the others. This is where Zangwill's decision to stage a crucial moment of the play around the Ruth pledge takes on new resonance. As mentioned at the start, Vera utters a version of the pledge to David. Inciting the Bible, but changing the context, the play is actually performing what it advocates, a merger or melting of past Jewish texts and values with modern American ones. In revising Ruth's pledge, the play also suggests that one can convert to nationality. Again, religious conversion by Jews is explicitly rejected. When her anti-Semitic father is horrified that Vera might, quote, become a Jewess, exclamation point, Vera responds, no more than David has become a Christian. We were already at one. Surely, Father, all religions must serve the same God. This obviously echoes what Ruth's father said at the end. Instead, David is depicted as a convert to America. Throughout the play, the language of faith is employed to theorize Americanness. David, as you can see, calls himself an apostle of America. He looks with religious rapture towards the flag. He's described the melting pot as God's crucible. God is making the American. Later, he declares, I keep faith with America. I have faith America will keep faith with us. So actually, when Vera is declaring to David, thy people shall be my people, she's promising to respect his Jewish heritage, but really the people she's referring to are the American people. Still, at first, David resists Vera's impassioned pledge because he can't quite move past her father's crimes. Suddenly, this too might echo the Book of Ruth, in which Naomi discourages Ruth initially with her entreaties, only to be persuaded of their sincerity upon repetition. By the play's end, no surprise, David has embraced both Vera and the idea that together they can unite through pledging allegiance in America. If David is converted to Americanness, though, what happens to his Jewishness? The melting pot metaphor, its own kind of conversion, raises the same question. Zangwill himself, both in the language of the play and in subsequent comments, fluctuates, somewhat frustratingly, about whether the melting pot purges or merges prior identities. Sometimes the play's language does imply that Americanness is a kind of replacement identity, supplanting an outdated Jewishness. Yet in response to criticism, Zangwill wrote, quote, the process of American amalgamation is not some simple surrender to the dominant type, as is popularly supposed, but an all-around give and take. He added, the Jew may be Americanized and the American Judaized. Like Ruth in the Bible, a welcomed convert who is still labeled a Moabite even after immigration and conversion, the play suggests Jews can convert to Americanness and keep their Jewish affiliation if they choose. Ultimately, the play's end tilts towards this view of Jewishness and Americanness as mutually enriching. Just as in the opening scene, the closing scene returns us to the curious blend of Americanism, Jewishness, and music. It's really quite something. It takes place on July 4th, which is also Shabbat. The Statue of Liberty is in the background. My Country 'Tis of Thee is playing in the distance. And the new American Symphony that David has written has just debuted. It's almost as if the entire scene was written retroactively to prove Beth Wanger's later claim that Jews often constructed a shared history with America rooted in the biblical heritage and turned to national holidays, especially July 4th, to define their place in America and often to define America itself. The connection between defining America, the Book of Ruth, and Zangwill's play is reinforced in the 1914 edition. Among the appendices is Frederick J. Haskin's poem, The Alien in the Melting Pot. I'm just going to highlight a few parts here. The poem begins, I am the immigrant. I make half the gloves. I make half the tobacco and cigars. And yet I am the great American problem. In what I'm hoping now seems like a familiar, perhaps a too familiar pattern, Haskin closes by adapting the language of Ruth to reframe this so-called problem and assert immigrants' rights to America. My children shall be your children, and your land shall be my land, because my sweat and my blood will cement the foundations of the America of tomorrow. If I can be fused into the body politic, the melting pot will have stood the supreme test. Wolfe, Zangwill, and Haskin all end their works looking to the future. In closing, I'd like to follow their lead. Whether one thinks of the melting pot, or whatever you think of the melting pot metaphor, it is currently undergoing a supreme test, as Haskin puts it. I want to briefly highlight how the Book of Ruth continues to be drafted into debates about American immigration, religion, and belonging. Not surprisingly, adaptations of the Book of Ruth still take many forms. Just as a sort of brief thing, I will note that I just recently read that Tyler Perry is creating a new film that will be out shortly called R&B for Ruth and Boaz. So that's one way that the story is being reinterpreted. But most of the current Ruth references I found are responses to the Trump presidency, specifically the efforts to ban or block immigration and the continual disparagement of immigrants and others. I'm guessing, even though we're in Canada, this rings some bells. Writers and religious leaders revisited the Book of Ruth to process and condemn these events. For example, Rabbi Arthur Wasco wrote a prose poem titled A Letter from Ruth the Moabite to King Donald of America. This was in 2017. It's very fascinating. Inhabiting the voice of Ruth and recalling Haskins' first lines, Wasco says, "I am an immigrant to your country. The last time I was an immigrant, I was called a Moabite. I think in your country, this is now called Mexican." Similarly, in the Jewish magazine Tablet, Margot Schlanger takes up Ruth as a response to Trump's policies that fail to, quote, welcome strangers in need as Ruth was welcomed, and asks the public if they will kind of aspire to show the same kindness and chutzpah that were shown to Ruth. Last but not least, there's the American Values Religious Voices Project, in which religious leaders from across faiths wrote 100 letters to Trump and Congress. They also continued this in the Biden administration. I should note they did another 100 letters, the same religious figures. 2 letters define being, quote, as welcoming of the immigrants in our midst as the people of Bethlehem were to Ruth, as a core American value. Quote, heed the story of Ruth, they urge. Xenophobia, racism, sexism, misogyny, and barriers to immigration deserve no place in our national narrative. As I've tried to argue today, what has had a place in our national narrative, in the American narrative, even if we haven't always recognized it as such, is the Book of Ruth. Writer Joan Didion famously observed, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." I want to amend that slightly and say we might retell ourselves stories in order to live, returning to the same narratives again and again, but adapting them to new historical realities and personal desires. In this way, we too are like Ruth, sticking with Naomi. We refuse to leave Ruth's stories behind, hoping that if we follow it with love, kindness, and determination, we too will end up in a better place. Thank you. Now, I may have been talking about many things nobody here has read, but perhaps there's some questions.